With the defund the police movement happening during major civil unrest in a mostly cash industry where business addresses are publicly listed with a thriving illicit market, how do we determine what works in regards to policing and the cannabis industry? Fortunately, we have an amazing panel and we're going to talk about it and we're going to maybe figure some stuff out. So thank you, Chris Roberts, for offering to moderate this panel for me. Please, we're in your hands.
You're welcome, Susan, and thanks for everyone who's tuning in on this Thursday afternoon. At least for me, it's a bit sultry. But we're joined today by Jim Channon and Kyle Kazan. Terry Blevins may yet join us, but in the meantime, gentlemen, why don't you both, and Kyle, as you can see, is literally and figuratively putting in the work. He is indeed on his treadmill, everybody. It's important to stay mentally and physically fit. But Jim and Kyle, why don't you start us off by briefly telling us a little bit about your very unique relationships between the cannabis plant in the context of law enforcement. And Kyle, if you want to begin, there you go. All right.
So thanks, Chris. Susan, thank you again for the kind invitation. This is really one of the ones that I like more than just talking about my business, which is what I'm asked usually to speak with. I'm much more passionate about this. And by the way, I love the new microphone, Susan. It's very cool. Like it. So yes, I born and raised Southern California, and amongst things I did after college, I was in law enforcement for 5 years, mainly on the streets, heavily involved in the drug war, and made a lot of arrests. Not as many for marijuana, probably. If Terry comes, from Arizona, it's a different deal. From California, I smoked weed in high school, admitted to it, and they still hired me, and most of my partners had as well. So I always looked at it as pretty benign and kind of foolish. But I have not been a uniformed police officer since 1999, so it's been 21 years since I pushed a black and white around out there. But it led me to a point where not long after I left the department, within 10 years, I was speaking out with LEAP, which is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now it's Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And the goal used to be, so now it's police reform. Before it was to legalize and regulate all drugs. And what was interesting was the marijuana movement came after I had, and some people may rip me for saying that, but it really picked up speed as we got closer to the 2000 teens. 10, 11. And so I only got in this business after being asked many times if I would invest. And finally, as I saw the momentum pick up, I just felt like this was a business that I'd like to be in. And so, here I am. But when it comes to law enforcement, I maintain a lot of close relationships in law enforcement. I know a lot of the chiefs around here. I know the DA of LA County very well. And so luckily they're kind enough to call me and ask me thoughts at different points. And also I will be a pain in their neck when I say, this is what I think you should do. And I know we're going to get into it, so I won't lay it out, but there's a lot of strategies for the questions that I think are a lot on everybody's mind. And it's timely because right now, law enforcement, as we know it, there's a feeling for change that people want. And it's high time that we make some real changes. And so I'm hoping we don't miss the moment. And marijuana is sort of thrown in the middle of it. If you're defunding police, where does that leave how we handle marijuana?
All right, Kyle, thanks for that. And then, you hit on some topics that we'll spend most of the next hour discussing. But Jim, why don't you give us a little bit about your particular background in the relationship between law enforcement and cannabis, what you've seen and what perspective you bring.
Is that to me or to Jim?
Jim, yes, Jim. Can you take yourself off mute? Just hit your space bar or, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. Well, as I told Ms. Suarez yesterday and several other times, I don't have a very close relationship with marijuana, except for smoking it since I was 18, which was some 55 years ago. I do, however, sue a lot of different police departments. I've done 14, 15 wrongful death cases. Again, I've also done prison work, sued prison guards in Calipatria, all the way to Pelican Bay in California. I have represented hundreds, maybe thousands of people with claims against the police. Somewhere along the way, I started representing police officers and mainly women and minorities because they had the cases that I was interested in. I'm not opposed to representing a white male. I have done it once or twice, but it's not the usual thing that comes my way. I was on the Police Review Commission in the 1970s. We abolished the SWAT team in Berkeley and reconstituted it because at that time, the FBI and all of California did not believe in hostage negotiation, if you can believe that. And we brought in a New York psychiatrist who was also a police officer to teach hostage negotiation to the Berkeley police. So that was a big deal. And then I moved to Oakland in 1980. I've been a civil rights lawyer since 1978. And I have done some drug-related cases when I practiced criminal law, but I stopped doing that in 2008.
Okay, Jim, thanks. And we see Terry has just joined us. Before I ask him to jump in and describe his bio a little bit, Jim, have you seen any sort of transition in law enforcement's relationship to cannabis in that time frame, or since the passage of Prop 64? Has it been a maturation?
You're asking me? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so yes, I have. When I was going to Cal, we had a guy who got 5 years in prison for smoking a joint. So it definitely has changed since then. As recently as last year, the year before, I do a lot of interaction with the Oakland Police Department. They used to count marijuana as part of their so-called yield, which legitimized the stop. And we encouraged them to drop that, especially after marijuana was legalized. And so we have police officers now who, well, now it's legal in California, but even before then, we had police officers who would just find a joint and crush it and move on without doing anything. And that's a long way to come from 5 years in state prison. So I've seen it run the whole way. I'm happier the way it is now. And I still think we can do more.
Great, Jim, thank you. And Terry, thank you for joining us. Real quick, you just want to speak a little bit about your particular background in law enforcement, your relationship with cannabis, and just a little bit about your expertise. Make sure to take yourself off mute first.
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me, Chris, and the rest of the panel. It's great to be on this panel with you guys. I started in law enforcement when I was 21 years old, and I didn't really never understood sort of our government's overreaction to cannabis. But I still felt that it was illegal, and that it should be illegal. Didn't necessarily, agree with it. And but then, later in my career, I really started to see that we had a sick relationship to the war on drugs. And frankly, when I hear Jim talk, I have to be honest, it's embarrassing to me. I mean, I hear the things that he says, and it just disgusts me that we got it so wrong. And I was part of that system. I wasn't a drug cop because, like I said, I did feel that it was an overreaction, but a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, and maybe, I was complicit because I didn't speak out. And honestly, now I deal with some guilt because of that. And it's one of the reasons that I do the work that I do now, is because I really do care about trying to make some sort of even a small impact on, repairing things or and when I talk to people who spent time in prison for marijuana, I apologize to them. I say, I am sorry, as having been someone who was, part of that system. I'm sorry that you were abused by that system, and it's a real shame. After that, I ended up one part of my transformation happened. I had a grandchild that was cured of childhood epilepsy with cannabis. I also had friends that I was in Afghanistan and Iraq with who had severe PTSD, who were police officers themselves, who claim that they're alive today because of cannabis. And that it started me looking into, first of all, it made me realize that my government had lied to me, that there was a medicinal value. I mean, I could see it with my own two eyes. And for it to be a Schedule I, you have to, they had to stipulate that it has no medicinal value. Well, guess what? It does. So that made me realize right off the bat that my government had lied to me. And so I just started investigating, looking more. I joined LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. They were kind enough to educate me. I didn't agree with all of their platforms, but they just dove in and had me dive in. And I did read articles and books and investigate as much as I could. And I really just started to realize how completely wrong we had gotten the whole war on drugs. And eventually I found a way to actually work in the industry. I own a cannabis security company. And recently I've been working a lot on the issues that happened during the rioting and looting in order to try to, protect businesses. So that's just a summary of my relationship to this whole thing.
All right, thank you for that. So I want to kick things off. I want to pose this question to the entire panel. Anyone who wants to answer first can just jump in. But as everyone here probably knows, Prop 64 dedicated funding to law enforcement. There's a dedicated stream of cannabis tax revenue once it meets a certain threshold that are available to law enforcement agencies throughout the state. In addition to that, local sales taxes, when they go to a city or county's general fund, also directly fund law enforcement activities. Do we feel at this stage, is this an appropriate relationship? And obviously we have, for context, what happened last month at dispensaries in Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, many of which felt like that they didn't really receive, when they were victims of burglaries, they didn't really receive the necessary, or rather the law enforcement protection for which they paid. So yeah, let's talk about that first. So Prop 64, that dedicated law enforcement funding stream, is that appropriate? Should we change that? Who wants to jump in first? Kyle?
Sure, I'll jump in since I'm in the business and have a company that has a lot of different assets from grows and manufacturing and retail across the state. So I was a big proponent of Prop 64. I know there's a lot of debate. I'm sure a lot of people watching this really feel let down by what promises were made and not. But if we're so I want to make sure I acknowledge that there's anger about Prop 64. In regards to the 20% for enforcement, it's like everything else, and we have to reimagine what we want from law enforcement. Whether it's the law enforcement didn't cause the homeless, but they get thrown in. So what are you going to do with them? I mean, what do you do with the homeless situation when you send in a bunch of cops? I think the same thing goes with cannabis. What exactly do we want to do about the illicit market? And there's a lot of things, like how do you bring some of the people in the illicit market into the legal market? But if there's folks that are basically violating the law, and 20% is going in tax is supposed to go towards law enforcement, what do we want? And I would argue that it's putting more people in jail for marijuana just doesn't feel, seem, or is right. I think the way to address it is if you really want to try and end the illicit market and bring people into the legal market where people, the benefit of the legal market is, I think most people would agree, is the testing standards in California are the highest of any ag product of any state. So you know when you're buying something that was tested in a legal store, at least it has to hit that high level. And so I would argue that if you focused mainly on the retail, because none of our 4 retail stores can sell anything that's not registered in metric, meaning it's legal from seed all the way to our retail. And I would put the onus on the landlords. I would say, look, City of LA in their ordinance has a $20,000 a day fine on the landlord after they've received notice that they have a tenant that is not, doesn't have a business license, doesn't have a license. And quite frankly, I would just go to the legislature and make that alcohol, gaming, marijuana, and try and bring ABC together. ABC is alcohol and cannabis, and basically have a bunch of lawyers that just shoot these out. And if landlords don't take it seriously, I guarantee you, as someone who, real estate is my other profession, nobody budgets a $25,000 a day fine. It's game, set, match for you. So I think then we're not sending a bunch of police officers that at the end of that road, the worst thing that happens are the sheriff department comes out there and evicts the tenant. That's where you have a danger of a badge and a gun and somebody with marijuana, but they're not looking to arrest. They're simply looking to remove that person. And so I would use civil remedies like you would see in most other businesses, as opposed to black and whites, SWAT teams, things like that. That's not good for anybody. So that's how I would address it.
If I'm hearing you correctly, you feel that should the dedicated funding stream in Prop 64, should that go perhaps a BCC law enforcement effort, maybe not unlike what Governor Newsom has proposed? Or are you saying that at this point, law enforcement doesn't really belong in cannabis except to protect property?
So yeah, to clarify, what I would say is this: law enforcement I'm using as a broad tool. The law, let's call it Prop 64, that we are enforcing, I'm saying let's use civil remedies towards property owners and let them do the bidding. It's a lot cheaper for the state to just kind of put the hammer and the onus on the landlord, and basically just say, look, we're going to go after you to go after that tenant. And if all of a sudden, you start taking out all the retail, it becomes, and then you could do, as much as I don't like asset seizures, and Jim, don't attack me on this, I'm not a fan of asset seizures, but if it's delivery, you basically say, look, if you're not licensed and you're delivering, we will seize your car. So I like that a lot better than the old, got the gun out and get your hands up, because there's some percentage of that just goes seriously wrong. And I don't think it doesn't need to be that way. The 20% that's in this law, I think it's a good thing, in that if you're really going to regulate this, you need to have the funds to do it, but you don't need badge guns and billy clubs. And I don't think the cops really want to do it. Lawyers work miracles, and I'm sure Jim will back me up on that.
Okay, so yeah, Jim, Kyle, do you feel that?
I want to bring something up that's related, that sort of falls into Mr. Blevins' bailiwick. As he said, in this last series, I've been going to demonstrations since I was 17 years old in 1964. And all during that time up to now, I've never seen companion criminal operations. I'm not talking about Antifa or people breaking windows. I'm talking about real criminals who are seizing on the police being distracted from what they do normally by the demonstration, and actually hitting stores, businesses, right up and down the highway. For example, what you said about the cannabis dealers legal in Oakland, and Berkeley. That happened this last series. It wasn't done by anyone with any political persuasion. It was done by criminal enterprises who had more freedom due to the concentration of police elsewhere.
It also happened on multiple nights, Jim. How come police weren't able to offer more of a response even after dispensaries were robbed night after night in some cities?
Well, the cannabis places weren't the only ones. There was a car dealership that lost 55 cars in San Leandro that were just stolen off the lot. I think that the police departments all over the Bay Area and probably in California were simply unprepared for this kind of response. And it showed. They had no idea what to do and what was going to happen. They were completely unprepared. And I talked about this with the Oakland police this morning, in fact.
What did they say? Did they just say that they were understaffed, overextended? I mean, I think that a lot of people would accept that as an explanation of why a dispensary might be robbed once. But as many have said publicly, even after they alerted police to a break-in at their dispensary or their distribution center, their cultivation center, that there was repeat visits after that.
I'm not excusing what they do or what they did. I think they were completely caught flat-footed and were totally unprepared. It wasn't only cannabis places, although that probably has a lower priority in all honesty, but there were stores in East Oakland, there were car dealerships that got hit night after night, and they just didn't know what to do. They were completely caught flat-footed. They showed up in far greater force than was necessary at these demonstrations. And as a result, these criminals finally got it into their head that this was a golden opportunity. And then they kept striking. And I know that when the police showed up one place, they would drive up the highway and hit the other place. So it's a real problem that law enforcement has not dealt with before, and they handled very badly this time.
Can I just comment on that real quick? I've had a lot of
Thank you.
contact with Oakland Police Department on this issue. And the commander that was working on those days, he said that they sent the SWAT team out and they started going to some of the different cannabis businesses where they had reports that there were problems, and they were running people off, but they said they weren't able to get to all of them. And they said it was just, it was basically an issue of numbers. They were going, they were responding, they were doing what they could. And the way that he explained it to me, based on my experience in law enforcement, again, like Jim, I'm not an apologist for the PD. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but just based on what he was telling me, it sounds like it was just a numbers game. They were doing the best that they could. They were spread thin. Yeah, maybe they need to figure out a different way to do it so that they split up, or who knows. But that, at least my understanding is that they were trying, and they were just spread too thin.
You know, if I can add in,
Go for it, Kyle,
two of my stores, or two of our stores got burglarized heavy, and looting and stuff like that. And we were not anywhere close. One was in Berkeley and one was in LA. There were not protests near our stores. We were just, unfortunately, one of the 70 or so, Susan probably has a number, but that were targeted that night. And in fairness to the police, I think, in fairness to me, as someone who owns a store and is a fiduciary, this thing came at us all of a sudden. The protests were out there. I didn't expect violence. And all of a sudden violence hit, and you've got police already on tactical alert at the areas where there's protests to make sure things don't get out of hand. They're taking rocks and bottles and all kinds of things. And then all of a sudden opportunism comes in. It caught me flat-footed. It caught the police flat-footed. I wish it was better, but at the end of the day, I think we're asking miracles from the police. At the same time, we're screaming at them to reform. High time they do, but understand that the tornado, now if it happens this weekend, like the rumors, you'd hope they'd be much better prepared.
Well, this was something I've never seen. As I said before, they even had a police officer who was killed at the federal building, and they all thought it was part of the demonstration. And it turns out that it was a right-wing group. I forgot their name, but it's a
Actually,
name.
an Air Force. It was an airman
Yeah,
who
it
worked
was
in
he
security
was
for the
the
Air
police
Force.
officer, right? And it's just like everyone is there's a whole new day when all of these people are using these demonstrations as an opportunity to do criminal activity.
And to further their own agendas too. Like some of these right-wing groups want revolution. They want a race war. So
That's
they're
right.
doing what they can to try to cause that. They've been talking about this for decades.
But
That's what
equal
the
opportunity,
perpetrators of this shooting were.
you
That
know,
was
if you read some of Antifa stuff, they're also happy for revolution too. So let's be equal. There's bad folks on both ends of this, because I wasn't happy. The folks that robbed our stores, or sorry, burglarized our stores, I don't think there was any political agenda. I saw the videos. One guy dropped his license. He's a local guy. I don't think it was right or left wing. I think it was straight opportunity. But we've got a very interesting political vortex. Offline, I'd love, Jim, to hear about protests in the 60s at Berkeley, because it feels like we're 1968 again, like that. And I was one, but I've studied it.
So
I was there.
maybe less a political critique than a class critique. But I want to ask y'all this point blank. I mean, do cannabis taxes belong in the law in law enforcement budgets? We're also hearing some of you talk. I mean, do we have enough police? Do we need more? I mean, what should be done with cannabis tax dollars with regard to law enforcement? Do you feel like the cannabis industry is getting its money worth, or is there not enough security? I mean, we have a business that, at least until federal law is reformed, will always be an attractive target for burglaries, given the large amount of cash on site. So, should there be more police, at least for the time being? Should more cannabis taxes go to law enforcement?
Chris, if you don't mind, I'll comment on that.
Please.
I actually have some very specific feelings about that, and I've developed these over the last few years because I've been involved in these discussions in city councils and at the state level. And I believe that the police should not be involved in policing legal cannabis businesses. I believe that legal cannabis businesses should be inspected by civilians. I think that their focus will be different. I believe that law enforcement has a dark history with cannabis and marijuana, and I don't think that it benefits anybody if law enforcement gets involved in that. Now, as far as closing down illicit businesses, there might be an involvement eventually, but in the beginning, like Kyle said, I think there are a lot of civil sanctions that can be levied first, a lot of other options. We need to try to keep the police out of the commercial and regulatory sort of control of the commercial businesses, legal and illicit. I do believe that they should be involved in the protection. We had a really great call yesterday with Oakland Police Department. They were telling us that they need help because the Oakland City Council just took anything that would make them even remotely look like they had been militarized, including their helmets. So starting in a few months, Oakland Police Department is going to have to face riots with no helmets and no shields. To me, that's insanity. That's over the top. I believe that's an overreaction. And I believe that, and it dawned on me at that moment that we could forge a partnership with police departments. And we could say, let's try to do this. The cannabis lobby is a powerful lobby, and that money that is taken out of the cannabis taxes and that is put in a fund to give to law enforcement, that should be used on protecting cannabis businesses. Overall, that's my assessment of the situation.
The Portland City Council recently changed its law. The local taxes in Portland, Oregon were going towards law enforcement, and the Portland Police Bureau received about $2 million, I believe, from local cannabis taxes. That's now changed in the light of what's happened in the last month since George Floyd's murder. Should that happen in California as well? Should cannabis taxes stop going directly to law enforcement? Anyone who wants to answer this one can just jump right in. Jim, what do you think? Is that an appropriate use of cannabis tax dollars?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the idea that police have a dark history with marijuana, and I've seen it. But I think we have to look at what's just starting to happen, which is these stores getting robbed with people with guns, and what kind of defense they want. Whether police should be involved. Not at all. I'm not sure that that's the best idea. I do think that police should be under-involved, if not involved in enforcement of illegal grows and all that stuff because of the history. But I'm not sure when it comes to a shootout at a marijuana store that the police should not be available under any circumstances.
So if I can jump in, at our 4 stores, and this is no secret if you visit our stores, we don't have anybody armed. Our security guards, we could have them armed, and we've chosen to always not, because we really want the old bugaboo that cannabis is this dangerous drug removed, and that the shopping experience and the education experience is pleasant. I think law enforcement has a role in just protecting society. If for some reason cannabis businesses are targeted like they were in this last one, you would hope the police would react the same way that in case a bank was targeted.
Yeah.
But I don't think any extra. And then where Terry, I think, was going was in regards to like ABC, which is in California, it's the alcohol beverage control. They would have a few, I think they have 2 in LA County, 2 for 10 million people. These ABC officers used to be many more, but now it's down to that. And they work in conjunction with local police departments to do bar checks and things like that. There is a dark history, but there's a dark history, as I'm seeing some of the comments here, between the African-American community and law enforcement. Doesn't mean we just remove law enforcement permanently. I think we have to do better. We have to have body cameras. We have to have transparency. We have to have better policies. I don't know if law enforcement, it wouldn't be the way I would go to regulate the legal market and the illicit market. As I said earlier, I would use civil is the better way to go, because you'll have less bad outcomes if you have less badges and guns handling it, and you go just straight to court.
So in other words, if there's a citizen complaint about a cannabis grow or something like that, police would not respond. It would be maybe the Bureau of Cannabis Control, the officers that the governor is talking about, or it would be a civil response. In other words, if someone says, hey, someone's growing pot over there, it's not a police response.
So if it's an illegal grow, if and by the way, we're still we've got Apple Music, but we still have Napster, and we're still illegally downloading, and we're doing legal. So we're still we're in a state of flux. I would focus a lot of my resources on the retail. Then when it comes to the grows, a lot of that biomass is heading out of state anyway. But I would then I would try and have a central repository, again, lawyers in Sacramento, to be working with locals saying, hey, we got a complaint, or we looked at Google Earth and we see it looks like could be an illegal grow. Would you mind, Humboldt County, building in safety, or just to see, is this something that you permitted, because we don't have it in our database? And if not, would you mind, because we are going to then send a letter to them. And so I would have unarmed people going out there, people in polos that say Humboldt Building and Safety. I would treat it more like that. And then I would have the state law behind it, which basically will punish. If that guy's an owner of his property, he's in line for some big fines if he doesn't come into the legal market.
I mean, would that be? Go ahead. Sorry.
I agree with what you said, Kyle, and to go back to what you said, Chris, I totally believe that it should be civilian. They should be civilian. They might even be former law enforcement, but not operating as in a sworn, what we call a sworn capacity. They would be functioning as a civilian. And one of the main reasons I feel that way is because law enforcement until now has been resistant. Law enforcement leaders have been resistant to get training, cannabis-related training for their officers. So it's a mixed bag. The reaction of law enforcement is mixed because they haven't been properly trained. Each agency is independent. They do whatever they want. We need to keep law enforcement out of cannabis enforcement for now. It needs to be done by people who are trained, qualified, understand the nuances, and aren't going to go out and just seize. It's not as much. We still have officers seizing cannabis without really even knowing why they're doing it, just because, they used to do it and for whatever reason. And honestly, there needs to be accountability. I don't think a single police officer should be seizing any one leaf of cannabis in this state right now without some accountability, because they don't know what they're doing and they've so far been unwilling to be trained up on what exactly what the regs are. So stop, get out of it altogether. Do yourself a favor. You have a bad enough sort of relationship with the communities right now as it is, especially communities of color. Get out of it, leave it alone, and let us handle it with other agencies that are more qualified to do that.
And I want to pose this to Kyle, sorry, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'm sorry, one more time, Chris.
No, sorry, I just saw you take your mic off mute. I was going to ask another question, but unless you had something to add. Okay. So real quick, I want to ask everybody, have we seen a change in law enforcement attitudes or actions since Prop 64 passed? I know this is a broad question within California, a nation state, like our governor likes to say. There are a absolute dizzying number of law enforcement agencies in Los Angeles County. If you're in West Hollywood or Pasadena or Bell, you'll have a different experience than you would in Santa Monica, say. But what have we seen since Prop 64? What sort of adjustments has law enforcement made? Have they kept up their end of the bargain with legalization? Deb, you want to take that one for now?
Sorry, I broke up a little bit. What I would say, I'll take it a little bit, just the first shot at it before my colleagues here on the panel. So, and I don't mean to fire up the folks watching, but I think from the day that I left law enforcement in 1999, you look today and you see a lot more people that are reflective demographically of the community. They don't look a lot like white males, blonde hair, blue eyes, which there were a lot more of as a percentage of law enforcement when I came on in the 90s. I think that's absolutely positive. And also you see a lot more tattoos. I think the general attitude of the younger police officers is different than that of older police officers that go back closer to when Jim was saying you get a seat and you go to prison. So I think that, they're growing up each day. We're getting closer to just people just growing up with legal marijuana. So the change hasn't come fast enough, which is why, like, for instance, Terry and I have pissed off so many of our former colleagues and now former friends, because we, kind of speak truth to power. But I would tell you that no, law enforcement is out there to enforce the laws that we as a people have elected our legislature to pass. And so they passed Prop 64. I don't think our government exactly knows from our CEO in Governor Newsom how to handle this. And so it's up to us as citizens to let them know, amongst all the other changes we're asking for of law enforcement, let's remove them from this process. So by the way, and I'm just going to point out to you, Chris, since you're moderating, there's at least 2 questions I've seen about defund the police you may want to address if we have time.
I've been trying to ask. I've been saying if we want to take away the cannabis taxes from law enforcement budgets, first of all, but let me just take that one then. So defund the police. Was this something that people were thinking about prior to George Floyd's murder, or it seems like everyone here would like to see police removed, at least from cannabis, but like the last month showed, in sort of a state of crisis, that might leave cannabis businesses and others vulnerable. But so, yeah, do you feel at least cannabis taxes, should they be removed from police budgets, or should police budgets in general get smaller, and how much smaller?
Well, I think that defund the police means different things to different people. And I think that may be somewhat deliberate because it's perceived very differently. Some people feel have really good ideas about defunding the police in terms of getting like what's been discussed here about cannabis and using more mental health professionals with domestic disturbances, maybe having police as backup or available, but not present. There are a whole bunch of things you can do. But you can't defund the police, quote unquote, without having something to replace it. You just, it just can't be a negative concept. It has to be positive, like what are you going to do instead? Because a lot of things that law enforcement does is necessary. Not all of it, obviously, or I wouldn't be here, but a lot of it is necessary. So some of it can be done by civilians, and they're cheaper and in many cases better trained for those sorts of things. So what are those things? What resources does the city have or the public entity have to replace them? And let's do that. But I was going to say in response to your last question, I remember taking a hike down the hill from where I have a summer place in Mendocino, and I stumbled onto this guy who was growing what obviously was illegal. And he took out his gun and pointed it at me. And I just put my hands up and I backed up and I got the hell out of there. So I wouldn't have minded having a cop there, at that moment. But, so these are some real problems that we have to deal with. I don't think it's a simplistic catch-all phrase that's going to solve this one.
Chris, if you don't mind, if I could just address your question,
Yes.
you were talking, asking if Kyle is exactly correct. There has been a huge change. A lot of the younger officers, there have actually been studies. The Pew Research Center did a poll nationwide of police officers and found that over, I think, almost 70% believe that cannabis should be legal in some form or another, either medical or so in general, the attitude is changing. We see less and less police giving, legal cannabis businesses a hard time. I have a really interesting anecdote that happened that I just recently, I was speaking, when I go into these jurisdictions and I write security plans for cannabis businesses, I try to reach out to law enforcement and say, hey, we're here. This is what we're doing. What do you want to see? We want to make sure that we're providing, we're contributing to public safety as opposed to the opposite. And, so I was talking to this police chief. This jurisdiction has agreed to license cannabis businesses. They made an initial list of people that qualified. They invited them to come in for a meeting, and the police chief was there. And he said, it was interesting to me. I see these people coming in. These are people that are applying for cannabis licenses. These are regular people. They're business people. They were coming in with their families. He said, these weren't potheads, And I'm thinking to myself, duh, but the reality is that that's still, and I mean, he told me that he had originally been opposed to cannabis or to marijuana as he referred to it, but he was starting to change his way of thinking, especially after he'd been exposed to legitimate business people that were working in, and I know in a way that's kind of profiling on his part, and maybe that's, not fair, but it is what it is. At least we're making a better impression on them, and we're letting them know that, I wish there were more people of color in the room, to be honest with you. There's not nearly as many of those as there should be. Hopefully that's something that we can, work on, but at least they are getting a better impression of the industry and of the people that are involved in the industry. And I hope eventually that they open their mind to the whole benefit of the plant. That's one thing that I know some of my friends are just so far away from even grasping, the importance of this plant. And I try to share research and articles with them so that they understand it. But I think that's still a long ways down the road. So.
if I could take one little stab. So I love the, Chris, you're doing a heck of a job, and Jim and Terry, it's fun sitting on the panel with you guys. You guys.
And then Kyle, how many calories do we have now on the treadmill?
Thanks. Oh, I'm like over 12 miles today. I'm feeling pretty
Well
good.
done.
I'm thinking about eating while you're on the, treadmill.
I know. Up. Is that okay with you? Yeah.
Apologies to everybody for my unprofessionalism, but it just keeps my brain flowing with blood.
I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Defund the police, it's really interesting. I think when Jim said it means different things to different people, it's like a chameleon out there. I have friends on all sides of the political spectrum, and I've been trying to do 90% listening, 10% talking. And it's amazing to hear. And I guess what I would say is, as an entire group of society, what problem are we trying to solve? And how does law enforcement do it? And when people say, defund the police, when I was a police officer and I got called out because there was a homeless person who was lighting fires and the neighbors were scared to death, and the person was having obviously a mental breakdown, I come out there, I don't have a mental hospital to take him. If he can just answer some basic questions so that he's not showing that he's a danger to himself or others, I don't have many options. So I'm the wrong person to send to that. Yet, what am I supposed to do? And then if he pulls a knife on me, and all of a sudden it's like my training is going to kick in, where it's going to start heading towards the wrong direction. And so if we look at things and we say, what do we want our police to do? When Jim says, look, someone points a gun at me, that's probably a good time where you want a cop. And when I taught in South Central Los Angeles, the riots occurred in the middle of my time as a special ed teacher down there. I can tell you, the gangs ran those streets. The Grape Street Crips ran Grape Street. And it was dangerous for me as a school teacher. And they knew what I was doing down there was still dangerous. I felt good seeing LAPD because I felt like they wouldn't attack me when LAPD is standing there. So there is a role for law enforcement. And as a longtime LEAP member with Terry, I would tell you the drug war, that's not a crime's person. That's not a crime's property. And I would stick law enforcement like that. I wouldn't use defund police. I would say, let's find appropriate funding to the needs of society. Law enforcement has its area, civil and criminal, and so does mental health. And God, we could use a lot more funding for that. And also homelessness. So there's a lot that we need to do as a society. And also the crime that does occur in the poor areas of our country, we need to provide better opportunities. And a lot of these companies like ours need to provide legs up and opportunities, because that's how you end some of the different cycles. But it's not just police. There's a lot that we as a society need to come together on.
Let me ask this to the entire panel as well, and this obviously is relevant because of the anecdote, Jim, that you brought up. Having a gun pulled on you is a scary experience. I want to incorporate a question that we just received from Alan Steiner. We've been talking a lot about policing in cannabis, but what about the drug war generally? We sort of touched on this a little bit. What does happen when there's a trespass grow in Mendocino County that might be connected to some criminal, organized or otherwise? What do we do with cannabis leaving California? I mean, obviously, we have more law enforcement in the state than just state law enforcement. We have various federal agencies, Border Patrol, as well as DEA. Should we see all police exit all kinds of drug enforcement, just cannabis? Is there a line we draw somewhere? I think a lot of us are seeing what's happening in Oakland with the decriminalization of psychedelic plants, and that seems encouraging. It seems to be working there, but we just stop there? I mean, is there such thing as a violent drug, or where's the line, gentlemen, do you think?
Chris, that's a really good question. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
So that's a really excellent question. And that is sort of, an area that is sort of a gray area, but I'll tell you what my feelings on that. So I think what should happen is that if we do believe that there is a cannabis business that is affiliated with organized crime, with cartels, whatever, it would be a collaboration between the state and local cannabis agency, as well as they would need to get warrants. They would need to get a court order in order to go in and seize that property. And it's not hard to do. It's just like a regular warrant. You would get law enforcement involved as backup, but law enforcement would not go out there by themselves and start seizing plants, because we've seen where that leads. We've seen in the past what happens when we give them that opportunity to do that. It usually doesn't work out well. And when you get a court order and you're doing it in collaboration with other agencies, there's a much less chance that it's going to be done in a heavy-handed way. More likely, you're going to have to show proof that there are ties to organized crime. I just think that it helps eliminate, or reduce the likelihood that there are going to be some heavy-handed things that happen.
Okay, is that a problem now? I mean, do you feel like that? I think that a lot of us would assume that the illicit market being as big as it is, that's where you're going to see any kind of quote unquote criminal activity. I mean, do you feel like there's an issue of criminal activity creep into legal cannabis or under the guise of legal cannabis? Yeah, are we seeing that?
Well, I don't think that right now that it's a prevalent problem. I think that most of the illicit growers are just regular growers. They're people that were in the traditional market that are still working in it. We do actually have some people that have a foot in the legal market and a foot in the illicit market. Sometimes not because they want to, but because their ability to license has been restricted. So, but yeah, I believe it's and I've heard people say before, oh, the cartels are operating in California. I personally have seen no evidence of that. I have friends in law enforcement who the ones that are being honest about it, because there are some that use things like that to their own agenda. But I don't believe that the cartels or any sort of significant organized criminal organization is functioning in California, with cannabis especially.
And Chris, if I could add in to Terry, I got into this with legalize and regulate all drugs, get out of the drug war, and I know psilocybin or mushrooms, it seems to be the next up, but I hope marijuana is showing that legalizing it really did, if there's cartels in legal marijuana in California, I don't know of it. It really changed that game. So to me, and legalizing and regulating all drugs is the least worst option, in my opinion, because I used to get attacked by a mom that had her son die of a drug overdose, and she blamed the police for not getting out there and arresting him because he'd always be clean for some amount of time in jail. And I just feel that if you look at alcohol prohibition from 1920 to 1933, people wanted alcohol. People want all these drugs, marijuana being the biggest, and then it starts shrinking. But when it wasn't legal, the illicit market gets filled with folks that have a much higher risk tolerance than most citizens. And so what I would tell you is I would like to see, and by the way, as a side note, I think some of the problems with law enforcement and communities of color and poor communities in this country, my wife grew up in such a community and she's not white. And 2 doors down from her, when I picked her up when I was in college, she waves at a couple of guys and I'm like, who are those guys? She tells me the names and I go, oh, what do they do? And she goes, they sell drugs. And I go, who knows this? She goes, everybody. I go, even the police? She goes, yeah. So someone who told me to check my privilege, I was like, what the hell? What kind of, and it turns out, while the neighborhood saw the police as something necessary because there was a lot of dangers, they also didn't appreciate when they dragged those 2 guys to jail because those are the so-and-so brothers. And so the drug war really divides kind of that right and wrong. It puts it into not a good situation for police in the community. So then when the old woman down the street whose house got broken into and everybody thinks it's wrong, still won't talk to the police because of the divide. So I think it's really important to carry this on. And if you're going to do it, you also have to have drug treatment facilities. You have to have education. And the last thing I'll say, that I want to hog it, is if you think I'm crazy, think of tobacco. I graduated from high school in 1985. So that, 1, means I'm old, but 2, it's been a long time that happened, and it's been legal the entire time. And smoking in California, staying fully legal the entire time, is down over 50% through education. So just because something's addictive and legal does not mean that people are going to just rush to it.
Then is there a secret sauce? Is it, do civilian leadership, elected officials, do they just need to set priorities law enforcement follows, or is it just something that's going to happen with time, like a generational shift? And what's sort of the, yeah, is there a, there's obviously not a one size fits all solution because of how many different law enforcement agencies and communities there are. But yeah, Jim, I see that you've just tapped in. Like, what's the secret here? If there
Yeah.
is one.
What I was going to say is that I remember I did a lot of prison shootings in the 90s, and they were at level 4 facilities. And I was trying to find one in Corcoran one day, and I got stuck trying to get around this level 1 facility, level 2 facility that had just drug offenders. And it was gigantic. It was much, much bigger than the level 4 facility. You had to drive and drive and drive, and I couldn't get around it to get into the level 4 facility. And finally I did, and the thing was so enormous. And when I think about the amount of money that's spent on putting those people in jail and what could be done with that money towards treatment, towards giving them housing, towards lowering taxes, toward anything other than what it was for, which was a complete waste of money, total. And the only people who were for it was the prison guards union and some ignorant people who thought that was a good idea, but not me. I couldn't believe how gigantic it was, and I'm sure it's still there with people who are on parole. You can still get in trouble for smoking a joint if you're on parole, and things like that. And it's still a very biased, racially biased system that we live in that needs systemic change.
If you don't mind, I would just like to interject there. You know, the police, most people may not realize this, but if you ask most police officers today if the war on drugs has worked, they're going to agree that it hasn't. It's just really been an amazing change that I've just really seen even in the last couple of years. They don't necessarily think drugs should be legal, but they openly admit that the war on drugs hasn't worked. So I feel like we're starting to see a change in general, you know, in that sort of mentality. The other thing that happens with police officers is you know, historically they say, they agree that we ask our police officers to do things that they shouldn't have to do or that they're not qualified to do. Most police officers will agree with that. Chief David Brown, you know, we had the riots in Dallas and some police officers die, and he gave this really amazing talk, and he was talking about the fact that, you know, that the society asks us to do all of these things, and yet we may not be qualified to do it. We may not have the resources to do it. And he said, we can't do this anymore. It's not sustainable. And I've been asked a lot by people about that, you know, what he said. And the thing, you know, most police officers agree. So what we need to do is we need to, you know, when we talk about defunding the police, it's not necessarily about, you know, defunding the police per se. Yeah, there are some people who believe that they should be completely abolished from top to bottom. But like Jim said, and I'm very glad to hear your comments on that, Jim. I have a lot of respect for you, and you know this issue probably better than anybody. You're like the godfather on this panel, you know, and for you to say that, yeah, that there needs to be some reasonable discussion in this, some compromise, because we can't get rid of the police. I totally agree with that. There has to be some sort of compromise. There definitely has to be reform. And I believe that a big part of that, I don't know if you saw, City of LA just agreed that the city council just agreed to set up a program where many nonviolent calls would be responded to by civilians who are more qualified, especially mental health issues, family issues, that sort of thing. And that's really what should have happened a long time ago. But at least now we're starting to have these conversations and starting to see this change.
Hey, thanks for that. We're right at time. So to take us out of here, I just want to ask everyone in turn, if there's one reform or one step that's both acceptable but also practical, if there was one change that you could make, I know we talked about civilianizing cannabis enforcement. I know we talked about legalizing all drugs, but if there's a practical change that wouldn't cause blowback, because I think we've also established defunding the police might cause certainly a political problem. Yeah, but if there was one practical change that you think is doable right now that would improve the situation, Jim, you want to start us off? What would you do?
Yes, I would say get mental health civilians more involved in answering police calls, whether they be overdoses, whether they be domestic disputes, whether they be all sorts of things that a civilian can do and should do. That would be my one thing.
I would agree with Jim. Domestic is a little bit difficult after Nicole Brown Simpson and that whole thing, which puts all kinds of onus on police officers to make arrests whether they like it or not based on state law to protect the safety of people. So but by and large, I agree 100% with what Jim said, which is I'd almost wish police would come to the table and say, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. It's just crimes persons, crimes property, that's it. And and on a homeless situation and so many other things, and also offer up to people calling the police, would you like us to send you a mediator? Would you like us to send you something else? So I agree, lessen the scope of what we ask law enforcement to do, and I think we'll have less problems.
Would you like us to send the MRAP, in other words, in some jurisdictions? Yeah. So Terry, what about you? What do you reckon?
So I agree with Jim and I agree with Kyle completely. Just to clarify what I said about domestic, the domestic calls generally, you do need to send an officer, but you would send a social worker as well. Like he said, you would send somebody that could mediate. You shouldn't be asking police officers to mediate, to be a marriage counselor. They should be there just for as a protective measure, and someone else should be out there trying to resolve that situation. So.
All right, everyone. We're at time. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank Jim, Kyle, and Terry for joining us. Thank you for the informative discussion, and thank you to Susan for facilitating. And obviously, thanks to all the participants for tuning in. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for everything that you provide to what still is the California's largest cash crop and probably one of the more exciting industries to participate in some way. So thank you all.